Igor Gouzenko's place in history, but this is how they remember Gouzenko the man. The Soviet defector set off Canada's biggest spy scandal more than 50 years ago at the cost of his own identity. Today, Gouzenko's family paid him tribute publicly and lifted the veil on some of the mystery surrounding him. Raj Ahluwalia has our story.
The gravestones, row upon row, proudly tell the world of those buried here. All except this one. The man buried here lived a life full of secrets. Some he took to his grave. Igor Gouzenko has been buried in an unmarked grave for more than 20 years. Time, his daughter, Evie Wilson, says, left her at a loss.
There's an emptiness in your heart when you can't express your love to your real identity.
Igor Gouzenko's story, a cloak and dagger spy mystery, just as the Cold War was beginning, rocked the country.
Of a very serious situation.
It was 1945. Gouzenko was a clerk at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. He knew of every secret coming in from Moscow. 57 years ago today, he defected with top secret documents about a widespread spy network in the West trying to steal atomic secrets. It was sensational news. Dozens of people were arrested and charged with espionage in Canada, several more in the US and Britain. A royal commission eventually concluded Gouzenko had rendered a great public service to the people of this country. Gouzenko, though, was forced to live the rest of his life in hiding, under police protection, under an assumed name. He wore a hood over his head for public appearances like this one.
Because I was there in Soviet embassy.
Gouzenko's children grew up believing they were from Czechoslovakia. Today, for the first time, they publicly acknowledge their Russian name and story.
And it is with incredible joy that I tell you now openly that my name, my birth name, is Igor Gouzenko. And how proud and lucky I am to be a Canadian.
Surprisingly, a representative from Canada's intelligence agency spoke at the ceremony.
Clearly at this time in our history, Canada lacked the knowledge to deal with intelligence-related issues of this magnitude. And the Gouzenkos were virtually left twisting in the wind.
This author of a book on the Gouzenko Affair says that now, long after his death, he's finally getting the recognition he craved but couldn't have.
But he couldn't be recognized because, you know, he was supposed to lead an anonymous life.
Today, that anonymity came to an end. His family placed a plaque on his grave. Ottawa has promised to honor Gouzenko's contribution to Canada with a plaque or a memorial as well within 2 years. But for now, his family and friends are overjoyed and relieved with this. Raj Ahluwalia, CBC News, Mississauga, Ontario.
Who helped out. Today we're talking about, well, a little piece of Ottawa history, and on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen is an article that you wrote about a man named Gouzenko.
That's right. It was really this gentleman, Andrew Kavchak, who's in the picture, actually came and saw me, sent me an email a couple years ago and said we should honor Gouzenko. He was a Soviet cipher clerk who defected in 1945, and he actually lived in the building that I know Karen is standing in front of on Somerset Street.
That's right. A very interesting story.
It's a great story, and this fellow was very persistent. He went through lots of red tape to try to get the city and the federal government to recognize this as an historic event, and they've finally done it.
That's exactly where Karen is this afternoon. Karen's in for Cindy Edwards, who has the day off today. Karen, what's your location in terms of an address of sorts?
It's actually Dundonald Park is where we are, and the address where Igor Gouzenko lived was 511 Somerset. And Elizabeth Arnold joins me now. She is the councillor for this ward, and once the plan started to unravel, they came back together again, and you were a driving force between the initiative to honor Igor Gouzenko and get a plaque up in this area.
Well, it's just such a fascinating story for our nation and for our community that I thought it was really important to pursue commemorating where this incident happened.
And exactly what does the city envision for a plaque to remember him, and what happened?
Well, we are now set to go to have a plaque installed in Dundonald Park, just across from the property where Mr. Gouzenko lived. And we're looking at having a commemoration ceremony sometime this spring, as soon as we get rid of the snow and have good weather to do a ceremony. And we're hoping that the family will agree to join us at that ceremony.
Now, unfortunately, his wife passed away in 2001. She won't be able to see that, but it will be in this area. And do you know exactly where the plaque will be?
I don't know the exact location, but we're hoping that it will be in a location where we'll be very close to the building. It's just across the street. And of course, a place where people will be able to see the plaque and read it and understand this little slice of history that happened right here in Dundonald Park.
Yeah, he broke a Soviet spy ring, smashed it wide open, you could say clear cut open. And the man who realized the story at first was Andrew Kavchak, and we're going to meet him in a couple of minutes' time. But he sparked the interest in getting this going and obviously caught your attention as well.
Well, Mr. Kavchak has been relentless in pursuing this story, and I really have to thank him for his persistence, because there were a number of times when I thought this wasn't going to happen because of concerns from the federal government, which has now changed their position on the issue. And of course, through the process of amalgamation, there were a lot of files that didn't happen as quickly as possible, but he's been pushing for it, and I'm really pleased that he has been.
All right, Elizabeth Arnold, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, the man behind the installation of a plaque here at Dundonald Park joins me now. Andrew Kavchak has been fascinated by the story of Igor Gouzenko for a number of years, and it's going to happen. It is finally going to happen.
Certainly, what a relief. After all these years, I'm very happy about that.
What sparked your interest in this story?
Well, I've always loved history. I've always loved reading a lot about history, and I came across in two used bookstores here in Ottawa these two different books. One was the 1946 biography of Igor Gouzenko, and the other one is the 1946 Royal Commission report, which described the story of exactly what happened here on September 4th to 7th in 1945 in this building behind me. And it's a fascinating story because what happened, the Second World War finished on September 2nd, 1945, and just 3 days later, when everybody around the world was hoping that peace would break out, a Soviet cipher clerk at the Soviet embassy decided he wanted to stay in Canada rather than go back to the Soviet Union, and he walked out of the embassy with 109 documents detailing the extent of Soviet espionage. And he approached the offices of the Ottawa Journal, and the night editor, who had the scoop of the century in the palm of his hand, didn't believe him and told him to come back the next day. So he stayed overnight in his apartment, which was on the second floor, and went back to the Ottawa Journal offices the next day. And again, the daytime editor didn't believe him and told him to go away, go elsewhere. So he went to the offices of the Justice Minister, Louis Saint-Laurent, and was made to wait for several hours in the waiting room, and was finally told that the minister would not see him. Now, unbeknownst to him, what happened was the minister had contacted PMO, and a decision had been made to ask the RCMP to tag Mr. Gouzenko, to follow him to see if he was the real McCoy or a crank. So when Mr. Gouzenko came back here that night, his wife, who was pregnant at the time, and their 2-year-old son couldn't stay in their apartment. They were sort of caught in no man's land, and they ended up asking a neighbor if they could stay in the neighbor's apartment for the night because they feared what the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, subsequently called the KGB, would do. And during the night, Mr. Gouzenko looked out the window and he saw here on the park bench two officers, two men, and he thought they were KGB, and he was very scared. It turned out they were RCMP officers, and in the middle of the night, what happened was Mr. Pavlov, the Soviet KGB head in Canada, and two of his thugs went into the apartment building, went to the second floor, and broke down the door to his apartment while he was looking at this from the neighboring apartment through the keyhole. So what this was the first significant event of the Cold War, and it didn't happen in Washington or Moscow or Berlin. It happened right here in downtown Ottawa.
Right here in Ottawa, so they realized he was the real McCoy. We're going to get more of the story a little later on, Andrew, and the significance of the plaque that will be unveiled, hopefully this spring, by the City of Ottawa, right here in Dundonald Park. Kurt, back to you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Incredible story.
Well, I am live from Dundonald Park today, where in the spring a plaque will be unveiled to remember Igor Gouzenko. He was a man involved in espionage who broke the Soviet spying here in Canada, blew the whistle on it, and the plaque is, you can almost take a lot of credit for this, Andrew Kavchak, because you followed this story, you knew the story, and you're the driving force for getting it here.
Thank you. Well, that's right. In the summer of 1999, when I was on parental leave, I used to come to the park over here, and at that end there's a children's playground. And I knew the story of what happened at this building at 511 Somerset, and I just couldn't believe that in this corner of the park there was not some sort of a official plaque or government mark to show, you know, the special nature of this particular area. So I began a process at that time in 1999 of applying to every federal and municipal politician who would hear me, and I asked, you know, I proposed that they put up a plaque here. And the red tape that I encountered was incredible. I got bounced backwards and forwards. There were delays, there were flip-flops, and all of this. There were some times when I thought this isn't going to happen, but at some point you sort of progress so much, you just keep going and hope that things will eventually work out. And based on the positive recommendation of the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board, the Minister, Sheila Copps, the Minister of Canadian Heritage, sent me a letter last July indicating that she had made the official historic designation of the Gouzenko Affair as a significant event in Canadian history and committed to unveiling a plaque in the spring of 2004. And this past week, the city announced that they would recognize the historic significance of the building with a plaque this spring. And the only disappointing story in this is that Mrs. Gouzenko passed away in September of 2001. Igor died in -- but Mrs. Gouzenko, if the city or the federal government had unveiled a plaque in the year 2000, she would have been able to attend the ceremony, and that would have been a truly special event. You know.
It's truly a fascinating story. We are out of time, unfortunately, Andrew, but very quickly, I know you want to wish a special happy birthday to someone.
That's right. It's my son's 4th birthday today, so happy birthday, Michael.
Thank you for joining us this morning and sharing this wonderful story with us. It is, in fact, Kurt, a fascinating story that is going to be remembered now, and of course, blowing the whistle on the Soviet spying in Canada during the 1940s is certainly something that has to be recognized.
Absolutely. You can read more about it, by the way, Jim's column in the Ottawa Citizen today.
That's right.
A man who came to be known as Canada's Cold War hero is being honored today in Ottawa. On September the 5th, 1945, Igor Gouzenko defected from the Soviet embassy, bringing with him details of a communist spy ring in Canada. He was granted political asylum but remained in hiding for the rest of his life, often appearing in public with a bag over his head. Today, Gouzenko's bravery will be formally recognized when a plaque is unveiled in Ottawa. Andrew Kavchak has been lobbying for years to get the city to honor Gouzenko. He'll be part of today's ceremony, and he joins me now from Dundonald Park in Ottawa, where the plaque is going to be unveiled. Mr. Kavchak, tell me why Mr. Gouzenko is so important to you.
Well, I think Gouzenko is a hero, and he's my hero. And when the Royal Commission in 1946, studying his revelations, concluded its report by saying that by what he had done, he did a great public service for the people of this country and placed Canada in his debt, I think that says it all.
Do you have a personal, I mean, he may be a hero, but obviously for someone to mount a campaign like you have, you must have some kind of a personal connection to this story.
Well, I always found history to be fascinating, and in Canada, all history relating to intelligence and national security matters and espionage always starts off with a chapter on Gouzenko. And I used to come to this park across the street from the building where he lived at the time of his defection, and I couldn't believe that something so dramatic that happened just 3 days after the Japanese surrendered and formally ended World War II was not here commemorated with some sort of a historic marker or plaque. And so in 1999, I began a process of lobbying both the federal and municipal governments to unveil a plaque here, and the city is unveiling a plaque this afternoon, and I received word from Heritage Minister Sheila Copps last July that she had made a formal historic designation of the Gouzenko Affair and would be committing Heritage Canada to unveiling a similar brass commemorative plaque here in this park next year.
Now, is that the apartment building behind you?
Yes, it is. 511 Somerset Street in downtown Ottawa. And Igor Gouzenko lived with his wife on the 2nd floor. They had a 2-year-old child, and at the time of the defection in September 45, Svetlana was pregnant. And it was here where he spent 2 harrowing nights where nobody was listening to him. He left the embassy with 109 documents detailing the extent of Soviet espionage and wanted to go to the offices of the Ottawa Journal as well as the Minister of Justice, and nobody listened to him for 2 days. So on the 2nd floor where he was living, he went to a neighbor's apartment because he believed that the Soviet secret police would be coming after him. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, they did. Mr. Pavlov, the head of the KGB at the embassy at the time with a couple of his thugs, came up the building and broke into his apartment while Gouzenko was looking at this through the keyhole of the neighboring apartment. So the drama here is better than any spy novel that I've ever read.
So was it tough to persuade officials that this should be recognized and noted in some way?
Well, it most certainly was. I got a lot of bureaucratic runaround, red tape, procedures, delays. So far I calculated it's been 1,395 days since I started my campaign. By the time the federal government puts up their plaque, it'll be over 1,700 days next year. And I don't see why, it had to take so long unless if there was some initial resistance of sorts. But fortunately it was overcome, and persistence pays off.
So who's going to be there today?
Well, the mayor, Bob Chiarelli of Ottawa, is going to be here, and Councillor Elizabeth Arnold for this riding, who has been really helpful in moving this along and overcoming all the obstacles that I've encountered. And there's a number of dignitaries who've been involved in the Gouzenko story over the years, who've helped the family. There's going to be a number of dignitaries from Parliament who I hope will, they've been invited, I hope they will come. And certainly I'll be here, and as will my family.
All right. Now listen, I know that the plaque's not in place yet, but give us an idea of where it is from where you are now. So if the cameraman there can help us out with this.
Okay. Well, the pedestal has been installed a few days ago, and the plaque itself is coming. It's going to be installed around noon today. It's coming from out of town, and it's just at a location about 10 feet right of where I am. It's going to be directly across the street from the building itself where Gouzenko lived at the time of his defection.
Mr. Kavchak, thank you very much for telling us about this.
Thank you.
Good luck today.
Thank you.
Andrew Kavchak led the campaign to have that plaque installed honoring Igor Gouzenko.
In just a few minutes, first time to check in with our guest host, Alex Munter, City Councillor and Deputy Mayor, and an interesting spy story today. Alex?
There is, Kurt. Thank you. For most Canadians, the Cold War between East and West is something that happened far away. The Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet invasions of Czechoslovakia or Hungary. But in fact, one of the earliest episodes of the Cold War, in fact, even before that term was coined by Winston Churchill, it happened right here in Ottawa. This is how Canadians saw, or I guess didn't see, a Soviet defector Igor Gouzenko in the 1940s. His decision to stay in Canada helped intercept Soviet messages by turning over the code and uncover Soviet espionage. Our special guest this afternoon is Andrew Kavchak. He's, I guess, a self-taught historian who led a one-man crusade to shed some light on this part of Ottawa's history and Canada's history and the world's history. Welcome. Glad you're here. Now, this afternoon's a big occasion. What's happening today?
Well, today's the ceremony in which the City of Ottawa will be unveiling a historic plaque to commemorate the defection of Igor and Svetlana Gouzenko, or as the city in their invitation cards calls it, the flight to freedom, the dramatic flight to freedom of 1945.
And where's that happening?
It's going to be happening in Dundonald Park, right across the street from the building where Igor and Svetlana Gouzenko lived in September 45. And that's at the corner of Somerset and Lyon Street downtown.
So the ceremony's this afternoon, and it marks the site of his home, but also he had a close call there, didn't he?
Well, he certainly did. There were a period of about 48 hours, 2 days, during which he had an unfortunate series of events that happened. He walked out of the embassy, the Soviet embassy, with 109 documents detailing the extent of Soviet espionage activities in Canada. And he wanted to first go to the offices of the Ottawa Journal and let them have the scoop of the century, effectively. They rebuffed him. He went to the offices of the minister, Louis Saint-Laurent. There was nobody there. The commissioner told him to go home, so he overnighted at his apartment with his wife, who was pregnant, and their 2-year-old son. But the next day, he tried it again. And again, he was rebuffed. This time, the Ottawa Journal didn't want to have anything to do with him, and the offices of the Minister of Justice made him wait for several hours and then told him the minister will not see him. So he returned to his apartment and told his wife they couldn't stay there because by then the security services at the embassy would have realized that he didn't show up for work, documents were missing, and the NKVD...
the forerunner of the KGB.
Exactly, they would come after him, and that wouldn't be in his best interest. So he asked a neighbor if she could stay overnight in their apartment, which she did. And during the night, the head of the KGB in Canada, a gentleman by the name of Pavlov, with 3 of his thugs from the embassy, came into the apartment building and broke into his apartment while Gouzenko was looking at this through the keyhole of the neighbor's apartment.
Oh, wow.
So this is a dramatic story that's better than any spy novel I've read.
And it's one that we don't really know a lot about in Canada. And that's, I guess, was what motivated you to try to get the city, and you had the help of Councillor Elizabeth Arnold, to get the city to put up the plaque as a way of talking about this history, right?
That's it. In 1945, it was kept under wraps by the government. They were liaising with the Americans and the British. In 1946, though, it became a huge event in Canada. There was a royal commission that studied Gouzenko's revelations when it was leaked and became public. There were 20 people who were arrested, and there were a series of spy trials and convictions. So people at that time were well aware of the story. But since then, it sort of faded away. And in 1999, I used to go to that park on a daily basis.
You lived in the neighborhood,
That's right. I moved into the neighborhood, and there's a beautiful little fenced-off playground in the corner. And I went there every day with my son when I was on parental leave. And from the bench over there, I used to look at the building, and I just couldn't believe that something so dramatic that really not only affected the history of Ottawa and Canada, but the world, because it was the first significant event of the Cold War that happened just 3 days after the Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay to General MacArthur. When everybody thought, we finally had peace, suddenly Gouzenko delivered an urgent warning that the Soviets were in fact spying on the West and were accessing atomic secrets and so on.
Now, you've put a lot of work into this. You've written letters, you've made the case, you've studied this. As usual, municipal government reacts first, so City of Ottawa is having the ceremony this afternoon, and it's going to be a big deal, but I think the federal government is going to follow our lead, right?
That's right. At the same time that I applied to the City of Ottawa back in 1999, I also approached the federal government and eventually found out that the appropriate place to channel such applications for historic commemorations is the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, and they only, unfortunately, meet every 6 months to review applications, so it took a long time before mine got on the agenda. But finally, last summer, on the positive recommendation of the board, the Heritage Minister Sheila Copps sent me a letter, and they also issued the same day a press release announcing that she had made the historic designation of the Gouzenko Affair of 45 to 46, and they're going to be unveiling a plaque in the park next year.
Making it a National Historic Site.
That's right.
Well, congratulations to you for all the work you've done, and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you.
Back to you, Kurt.
After nearly 60 years, the federal government is finally paying tribute to a man many say changed the course of history. In 1945, Igor Gouzenko was a clerk at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. He defected and gave Canada, his adopted country, evidence of an extensive spy network. Today, CTV's Joy Melvin reports the Gouzenko name was given a place of honor.
He was the man in the mask, Igor Gouzenko, who lived life in the shadows after defecting and smuggling secret Soviet documents, exposing a major spy ring in Canada that included Fred Rose, a member of Parliament.
What Gouzenko's revelations really did is deliver a very urgent wake-up call and warning to the Western countries.
And it all happened right here in Ottawa. 58 years ago, Gouzenko left the Soviet embassy with 109 secret documents. While he tried to convince the West of Soviet treachery, he hid out in his apartment. Fearing for their lives, Gouzenko and his family narrowly escaped next door when the secret police came.
Knocked on the door loudly, apparently, yelled his name, and then broke into the door. It's better than any spy fiction that I've read, and it's reality.
After years of lobbying, Andrew Kavchak convinced municipal and federal officials to pay tribute to the Soviet defector. In the audience, 2 of Gouzenko's children who've lived a life of secrets.
The idea that I can stand publicly and say my name and Gouzenko in the same sentence is probably the most rewarding feeling.
Journalist Peter Worthington knew Gouzenko, calls him a great Canadian who put his life on the line by revealing direct evidence of Soviet espionage.
He was the genesis of the Cold War, if you like. And the Cold War, if you hadn't had a Cold War, we'd all be speaking Russian now, I suspect.
For Evelyn Wilson, born 3 months after her father's defection, it means the mask of their lives has come off.
My father's essentially vindicated.
And after a life in hiding, the name Gouzenko is now being honored. Joy Melvin, CTV News, Ottawa.
A new plaque was unveiled in an Ottawa park today, paying tribute to the man in the hood. Igor Gouzenko was a clerk at the Soviet embassy who defected in 1945 with documents that proved a Soviet spy network existed in this country involving some Canadian civil servants. Gouzenko lived in a building across the road.
All here to honor the Soviet clerk who gave Canada his country's greatest espionage secrets half a century ago.
Indeed, Igor Gouzenko placed the entire free world in his debt.
Gouzenko was not here. He died 21 years ago, but many of his descendants were.
I think this is fantastic. Finally, someone's recognizing what he actually did.
Igor Gouzenko was a clerk at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. In 1945, he defected, taking with him more than 100 documents. Those documents proved that the Soviet Union had set up spy networks involving dozens of civil servants. Based on his evidence, 11 Canadians were eventually tried and convicted of espionage. He also provided evidence of Soviet spy networks in the U.S. and England. Why this park for the plaque? Well, Gouzenko lived in the building right across the road. And at the time of his defection, it's quite possible the Soviet secret police were all over this park, watching that apartment closely. Gouzenko thought he saw them out his window the night after his defection. He went to stay with his neighbor next door.
And sure enough, in the middle of the night, the KGB broke into his apartment looking for him.
Andrew Kavchak, an amateur historian, used to take his child to this park. He was surprised there was nothing here to commemorate Gouzenko. He spent the past 4 years lobbying to put the plaque here.
That was the first real significant event of the Cold War. Didn't happen in Berlin or London or Paris, but right here in downtown Ottawa.
Gouzenko spent most of his life in hiding, and his entire family changed its last name. His descendants hope that through this plaque, that name will live on. Steve Fisher, CBC News, Ottawa.
Most people who was or who is Igor Gouzenko, they might guess he's a defenseman for the Columbus Blue Jackets because the story really has faded from memory. But of course, he was a key local figure in the Cold War, and his contributions will be recognized at a two-day conference beginning this afternoon. Joining me now is Igor Gouzenko's eldest daughter, Evelyn Wilson, and Andrew Kavchak, the local historian who's done much to keep this fascinating and important story alive. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Now, Evelyn, I really want to hear your story about growing up in the family of a Soviet defector, but I think we got to hear that part of the story from Andrew first, seeing as you were there, but you weren't really there because you weren't quite born at the time this all happened back in September of 1945. Andrew, tell us how Igor Gouzenko came to public prominence.
Well, Igor Gouzenko's defection was a truly dramatic story. In September of 1945, just 3 days after the Japanese surrendered and World War II finished, Igor Gouzenko walked out of the Soviet embassy in Sandy Hill with 109 documents detailing the extent of Soviet espionage and tried to blow the lid off the spy ring that was happening. The Soviets had penetrated through their agents numerous government departments, including the project to develop the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. And he went to the offices of the Ottawa Journal, as well as the offices of the Minister of Justice, and was rebuffed. For 2 days, no one was listening to him. He returned to his apartment at 511 Somerset Street, where he was staying with his wife, who was pregnant, and their 2-year-old son. And he told his family that they couldn't stay there anymore. By then, the KGB would be looking for him from the embassy, and their lives were in danger. So they asked the neighbor if they could stay at the neighbor's apartment. And from the neighbor's apartment, they looked out the window at Dundonald Park on Somerset Street, noticed 2 men sitting on the park bench. Turned out they were RCMP officers, but they believed that they were KGB. And in the middle of the night, the head of the KGB from the embassy, along with some of his thugs, broke into the Gouzenko apartment while Igor was looking at this through the keyhole of the neighboring apartment.
You know, if it were me, I might have wanted to get a little bit further away, but...
Well, he had no choice. He was in no man's land, right. Had nowhere else to go, and thank God for him and the family in Canada that his neighbor was receptive and welcomed them for the evening. And at that point, the neighbor called the city police, and the city police and the RCMP then realized that if the head of the KGB was breaking into his apartment looking for him, he must have a story to tell. And indeed, the next day they brought him in for debriefing at the Justice Department building. And after that, there were 20 arrests, prosecutions, convictions of 11 spies, including the first of the atom bomb spies to be caught. And there was a royal commission in 1946 that concluded that by what he had done, Igor Gouzenko had done a great public service to the people of this country and placed Canada in his debt.
And it was one of the first times that not just Canada, but the West realized what the Soviets were up to, because we were on their side in the war, after all.
Well, in the second half of the war. The first half, they were allies with Hitler, right? Yeah. But after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, we were in a joint effort, a joint struggle to defeat Hitler. But during that time, Stalin had just done everything he could to penetrate his Western allies with lace the societies with spies.
Yeah. Now, Evelyn, I know this is still almost 60 years on, somewhat of a sensitive story, and you only recently have spoken publicly about it, but can you tell us at all what it was like growing up in this family? I take it your names were changed, you moved away, but I don't know how much of that you can tell me.
Well, we lived under a protected name, that's how I refer to it, as under what is now known as the Witness Protection Program. And quite frankly, we were like every other first-generation Canadian family. Our parents spoke a different language. They came from a different culture here to Canada. And we really didn't know anything different than that. We were perhaps cautioned more than other children. But that was unusual back in the late 1940s, 1950s. But today I would call it street proofing. So the level of caution that we experienced was not traumatic. It was just caring parents who wanted to make sure that we didn't do anything wrong.
Now, we don't know what your father looked like other than that famous shot of him with the hood, but obviously yes. The KGB knew what he looked like. So were you aware that he was in any way not being out in public as much as he would have? I'm just wondering how the level of your understanding as you grew up, that there was something perhaps a little bit different about your dad.
There was certainly feeling that we were different. We were we had parents who spoke a different language at home. We were not allowed to learn that language. Invariably, when I was young, growing up with my mother, didn't speak English for the first maybe 3-4 years that she was in. After the defection, she would invariably speak in Russian, so we picked up the Russian language, but we were told not to use it for obvious reasons, because our legend, our cover story, was a different country. It was Czechoslovakia. And I grew up thinking that the Russians were the bad guys, which invariably they were, especially invading Czechoslovakia as they had. And to learn that eventually, and I learned this when I was in my mid-teens, it was a shock, to say the least.
Quite a story. Now, Andrew, not only have you been tried to let people who weren't around, and most of us weren't around in 1945, about the story, you've also worked very hard to get this event, this important event in local and Canadian history and world history, commemorated with not just one but 2 plaques, the second of which will be unveiled tomorrow afternoon in Dundonald Park, where those RCMP officers were sitting back there.
That's it. Since 1999, I've been lobbying both the municipal and the federal governments to unveil historic commemorative plaques in the park across the street from 511 Somerset Street, where Igor Gouzenko lived at the time of the defection. And last year, the city unveiled a plaque, and tomorrow afternoon, the federal government will be unveiling and installing in the park a bronze commemorative plaque. And so after 5 years, this project will finally come to an end.
Wow. And the conference I mentioned too. Evelyn, how do you feel about this public commemoration, not only with the plaques, but the fact that, this is a big conference, the head of CSIS is there, so obviously the effect of what the brave thing that your father did is still felt now. How do you feel about that?
Overjoyed and overwhelmed. I'm so delighted that this has taken place and that we have the conference is going to enlighten people, and I would really welcome everyone to come to this public forum and learn more about it. I think that's the way that you know more about perhaps the present is from the past.
Right. Thank you. Very nice meeting you both, and congratulations on your efforts. All right.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to take a break here on the new.
Story, that of a clerk working at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa in 1945, a man willing to smuggle some of the most sensitive documents of the times to Canadian officials. Little was known about Gouzenko's story until his death in 1982.
Soviet Union when he smuggled out documents confirming extensive Soviet espionage in the West. The markers in Dundonald Park, where two Mounties camped out to watch Gouzenko's home after he tried to interest Canadian officials in his story, a story that the government first doubted.
Well, before the West was battling terrorism, it was battling communism. The true scope of the threat wasn't known until the defection of a clerk from the Soviet embassy in 1945. Now, an international conference is taking a look back at Igor Gouzenko and how he changed the world. Here's Danny Globerman.
As the years pass, there is the risk Igor Gouzenko will become simply that mystery man in the funny-looking hood. After all, it's the image most Canadians have of him. But to forget the man beneath the disguise would be to forget a turning point in the course of the 20th century, the birth of the Cold War.
Up until then, the assumption in government and in the public was that the Soviet Union is a friend and ally.
Rudner is one of more than 100 scholars and researchers who've gathered in Ottawa to discuss Gouzenko and his legacy. It's the first time that's ever been done. Gouzenko stepped out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa and into history on September 5, 1945, when the cipher clerk and his family defected. In his possession were 109 documents taken from the embassy. Their top-secret contents exposed everything from a Soviet spy ring operating in Canada to the Soviets' nuclear capabilities.
Well, this was an earthquake. The notion that anybody would be conducting espionage operations in Canada during peacetime, this was no longer the Second World War, especially on behalf of an ostensible ally, the Soviet Union. This would have been considered incredible. And indeed, it was an earthquake.
As Canada and the West awoke to the true depths of Soviet hostility, Gouzenko and his family went underground, assuming fake identities and living under police protection. Igor died in 1982, his wife Svetlana in 2001.
They never regretted a moment, no matter how difficult things were. They considered their life blessed. They also were successful in warning the West, and that was their main purpose.
Even so, there were parts of the Canadian public that still didn't take the warning seriously. 60 years later, with terrorists replacing communists as the West's greatest foe, this conference is wondering whether history will be repeated.
Today, we are caught in similar circumstances. There exists a threat to Canada. Many Canadians are not prepared to come to terms with the reality of the threat, with the existence of the evil that the threat represents.
Before this conference ends, the government will dedicate a plaque to Igor Gouzenko, marking his defection as an event of national historic significance. For his family and all who benefited from the collapse of the Soviet Union, it is a long overdue tribute to a man who believed in freedom and was willing to risk everything for it. Danny Globerman, CBC News, Ottawa.